Hello folks, welcome back. This is Chris in Central Pennsylvania. I just want to talk to you briefly about a press release that the South African Foreign Ministry, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO, released today, the 15th of June. It's a balanced statement, but it's also full of some information that's factually incorrect, and I'm going to cover that. So, 15 June 2025, media statement. South Africa expresses deep concern regarding the escalation of hostilities between the State of Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. As do I. We extend our deepest condolences to the peoples of both nations suffering from the tragic loss of life. Well said. South Africa emphasized that under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian infrastructure must never be considered legitimate targets. That's factually wrong, and I'm going to tell you why it's factually wrong. This is a foreign ministry that's spreading misinformation. That's actually disinformation coming from the government of South Africa. We reiterate our call for de-escalation, restraint, and full compliance with international law by all parties to prevent further human suffering. And inquiries go to Crispin Piri, ministry spokesperson. Well, that's factually incorrect, and this is disinformation being spread by the government of South Africa. They claim that under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian infrastructure must never be considered legitimate targets. That's factually wrong, and I know this because I was a military officer and I understand the law of land warfare and the Geneva Conventions and things like that. But you don't even have to know anything about that. You just do a quick Google search and go to Grok or one of the things, and it'll tell you the facts of the matter. When combatants use civilian locations for military purposes, those locations can lose their protected status under international humanitarian law, and that's a fact. They become legitimate military targets, and that's why hospitals in Gaza became legitimate military targets, because Hamas was using the hospitals for military command centers underneath them or operating inside them. That makes that location no longer protected, and that's the action of the combatant who did that, not the aggressor or not the attacker. But there are certain limitations on this. So this transformation takes place when it's used for a substantial military advantage. Running a operational headquarters from a hospital is a substantial military advantage and therefore negates the protected status. So we make the distinction in international humanitarian law and the law of land warfare between civilian objects and military objectives. Okay? Civilian objects include things like schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, hospitals, and homes, residences. So you might ask the question, okay, but Israel fired or attacked Tehran and it hit apartment buildings. They did, with surgical strikes targeting military leaders and scientists who were giving military advantage to Iran in developing nuclear weapons for offensive capability. That made those places legitimate targets. The role of the military then is to minimize the impact of it on civilians. And that comes to the rule of proportionality, which has always been the case about the question about Gaza, and certainly the case about what's happening now between Israel and Iran attacking each other. So proportionality, you must consider the potential harm to civilians in the surrounding area. And therefore, you can see these surgical strikes took out specific apartments in apartment blocks, not the entire building. That is a surgical strike. It's not a mistake. It was intentional. And under international humanitarian law and the law of land warfare, it's permitted. It's allowed because they have become legitimate military targets. There's also the principle of distinction that comes into play here, and you must distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives. But again, as I said, when a combatant uses a civilian location for military advantage, whether it's the home of a military leader or a nuclear scientist who's building a nuclear bomb, that's being used for military advantage. If you plant your mortar tubes in a hospital or at a school and fire from there, you've turned into a legitimate target. The person responding has a responsibility to use proportionality and not use more firepower, more military force than is necessary to achieve the objective of neutralizing that threat. So when the South African government falsely claims that they must never be targeted, must never be considered legitimate targets, that's factually incorrect. And I reiterate, South Africa claims in their press release, the 15th of June, 2025, that South Africa emphasized that under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian infrastructure must never be considered legitimate targets. In fact, they are legitimate targets when a combatant misuses civilian objects. That's a statement of fact. You can look it up. The government of South Africa is spreading disinformation, lying about the situation. The rest of this press release is fine. It speaks to ending the conflict and, minimizing injury to civilians and proportionality without using the word proportionality. But saying never is factually a lie. It's disinformation by a government source. And governments have an obligation to tell the truth, not mislead the public. This press release by Durko is misleading the public. It's not a statement of opinion, that's a statement of fact. You don't believe me? Go do a search on your own. Look up international humanitarian law and look up about how civilian objects have become legitimate military targets. So what about Iran? Is Iran intentionally targeting civilians? Well, that's hard to say. We don't know the efficacy. We know the impact of what's happening. Iran is firing missiles and using drones to attack locations in Israel. Now, the fact that they've actually hit the Weizmann Center, which is a scientific research center which supports the IDF, would indicate to me that they're seeking to hit legitimate military targets. So if they've hit apartment buildings, was it intentional or is it a mistake? Or is it collateral damage by a poorly fired missile, poor guidance system? Well, that's not a criminal act if it wasn't intentional. It's hard to know with the Iranian case. I suspect Iran just has not the best quality stuff and that they are not intentionally targeting civilians. There's nothing for them to be gained by terrorizing civilians in this conflict. They need to stop Israel's military capability, and I suspect that their objective is to do that. I could be wrong. I'm not trying to give Iran a free pass, but I suspect what they're trying to do is target Israel's military infrastructure by going after their defense headquarters, by going after their air bases, by going after their scientific centers, much like Israel is surgically doing to Iran. So, what say you? I tell you that this is disinformation, and the South African government shouldn't be doing this, particularly on the heels of Ramaphosa purportedly coming to the G7 conference in Western Canada to talk to President Trump. Spreading disinformation is not going to get you in the president's good stead. Ramaphosa didn't do it, but his ministry did. What say you, South Africa? What say you, world? Cheers.